Hello, and welcome to our webcast event, Technonationalism Redux, Balancing US-Japan Strategies to Compete with China, organized by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Jim Schoff. I'm a senior fellow of the Asia program at Carnegie, and we're glad you could join us today. There have been many different supporters of this project over the past year, but for today's event, I do want to say a special thank you to the Japan Foundation, CGP, who has been an important supporter of the working paper that we just published yesterday on the Carnegie website, upon which this event is based. We undertook this project because of an important transition underway from a techno-globalist economic and innovation framework that is one that takes advantage of reduced barriers to trade, investment, supply chain development amid harmonizing standards, to a framework increasingly techno-nationalist, where countries intervene often to advantage their own high-tech industries, sometimes at the expense of others. And we haven't seen this shift since a brief experiment in the 1980s and 1990s between the United States and Japan at that time. But the current era of techno-nationalist competition is likely to be longer and much more intense. So today I'm going to take about 10 minutes or so to share with the audience the results of the research that I've been conducting over the past year. And we're going to use at least 30 minutes then to hear other perspectives from our panelists to discuss their views and the potential implications for the US-Japan alliance. And then we'll wrap up with some questions from the audience watching on YouTube, and you can use the YouTube chat function to ask questions. I'm honored today to be joined by three very talented panelists. From Tokyo, we're joined by Tatsuya Terazawa, senior advisor to Japan's National Security Council and former Vice Minister for International Affairs at Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. Here in Washington, we're joined by Amy Celico, principal of the Albright Stonebridge Group and former Senior Director for China Affairs at the US Trade Representative. And again, from Tokyo, we have Jun Osawa, Senior Research Fellow at the Nakasone Peace Institute, and who has also served on Japan's National Security Secretariat. And I want to say a special thank you to the Nakasone Peace Institute for being a partner with us in this project. So let me take a few minutes to talk to you about the paper, and then we're going to bring in the panelists. So this new techno-nationalist era will likely be longer and more intense because the stakes are higher than in the 1990s. Today we have great power competition coinciding with the fourth industrial revolution. We have not experienced this kind of competition between such large militarily powerful and economically intertwined and ideologically competitive countries before. And the technology is potentially transformative, where artificial intelligence, big data, quantum computing, robotics, and faster communications might all combine in a way that gives the early leader an unassailable position. And fear of losing this competition is fueling an unprecedented scale of investment and a zero-sum mentality that, if we're not careful, will do excessive damage to the techno-globalist order that we have benefited from since the 1990s. In other words, we're in danger of overdoing it, and we don't have to upend globalization completely to address its shortcomings. Now, the United States and Japan have similar, but also diverging views about how to address this situation. And it was this previous round of techno-nationalism in the 80s and 90s that pushed the US to adopt, for example, the Exxon-Florio Amendment that strengthened the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, to limit or examine investments that could threaten US national security. The United States also created the US-only Semiconductor Consortium, Semitech, and a wide variety of other policies. And looking back on this era of techno-nationalism experience, I draw 5 main lessons that I just want to run off quickly here, because I think this will help us think about the coming competition ahead. So first, the US and Japan were correct to focus on competitiveness and innovation as important sources of national power and influence. Elements of industrial policy and focus on competitiveness certainly helped Japan's rise in the 70s and 80s, with US revival in the 90s, and it certainly contributed to China's success today. So I'm not here to say that techno-nationalism is bad and techno-globalism is good. Second, despite that first point, we overestimated the ability of government to affect change, and especially in the US case, we exaggerated the threat from a theoretical adversary to the point where we almost missed opportunities to work together for mutual benefit. Third, we were unable to predict where technology was heading. And many firms that progressed over the next 30 years did not even exist 30 years ago. Washington was fighting to protect Motorola and Texas Instruments, but they could not conceive of the need today to protect against AI-enabled cyber hacks of cloud-based data centers. Fourth, we were inconsistent with our policies over time. The US, for example, negotiated with Japan in the 1980s to open their market for satellites and supercomputers, only to slap tighter export controls on those same products in the 1990s, and then later to loosen them up again in the 2000s. And then fifth, the US and Japan navigated that techno-nationalist era successfully, I think, largely because they were, and we are, democratic allies and friends. That helped us make better plus some decisions, aided by robust private sectors in both countries that had close experience working together and shared interests. Also, Japan made a choice to embrace the existing global order in a way that China is not necessarily doing so today. So this is the challenge now, is dealing with this new kind of techno-nationalist competition that could go on much longer and be more intense. So the allies, I think, really should should leverage their shared concern about China and minimize the differences in our approaches. Our goal should be to strike a balance and promote our technology and economic interests on the one hand, while avoid damaging too much the open innovation and economic ecosystem that helps us prosper. Both of us, and the European Union as well and others, will benefit from as large as possible of an ecosystem in terms of research and development, product standards, market opportunities, and the norms that surround new technology use. So the working paper outlines all the specific steps that the United States and Japan are taking in these different areas, but I'll just lump them into some categories and talk about them, and then I'll get to the recommendations. First, export controls. This is a shared concern, and both countries are taking steps, but the US is pushing much more aggressively and unilaterally on this front. Both our private sectors realize the need to curtail some exports, but they want to sell to each other and to the EU. And this is forcing difficult negotiations over industrial technology security and harmonizing the rules for export controls. This is true not only in the areas of semiconductors, telecom, and software, but also raising questions for what research and development can be shared even within a company across borders, because that is also subject to export controls. It is pushing China to boost its indigenous development efforts, prompting other countries to reconsider US suppliers, and is creating a more fragmentation in the marketplace. Second, on investment restrictions. Again, a shared concern between the United States and Japan. We're trying to coordinate. Arguably, this is a more important area to get right in terms of intellectual property protection than export controls. Still, Japan is not on the FDI whitelist in the United States yet. And the 232 tariff threats, I think, in the United States reflect a deep misunderstanding by the Trump administration of the value of direct investment in our country. Japan, for example, is this year getting ready to surpass the United Kingdom as the largest investor of any other foreign country. So R&D and that kind of investment follows direct investment usually. Now, the US and Japan are doing a better job, I think, of sharing information to evaluate Chinese companies and investment funds that are investing in other countries, and sharing that intelligence is, I think, critically important, and we'll need to have some improvements in our information security apparatus between us to keep that up. On science and technology cooperation, the US is getting more restrictive now, and you see it in terms of visa limitations for Chinese researchers and to come study and work in US universities. This is potentially dangerous if we overdo this as well, because right now, roughly 40% of the US doctoral science and engineering workforce is foreign born, and a lot of them are from China. And Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, has said, the United States will not be able to do the work that we need to do in AI and other areas if we do not include all these researchers from around the world. So there's a push to expand the scope of research integrity to encompass what ties we have to China on this front, and we need to harmonize that between us and our allies. Protectionism is another area, import substitution and subsidies, multilateral versus unilateral remedies. This is a big area of friction between the United States and Japan, or at least a big gap if the friction hasn't emerged yet. And then standard setting and market maximization. The problems with the previous items I just outlined undermine our ability to coordinate with the United States, Japan, and the EU in this area. And there are both economic issues at stake here, but also values issues that we need to keep in mind. So current and future risks, I think the risk of underreacting is relatively low, though we might fail to implement effectively. The main risk, I think, is that we overreact and limit our own opportunities to innovate, attract the best talent, and be competitive in the broadest possible global market. And here, the South and Southeast Asia markets are particularly vulnerable in this tug of war. Also, there's a risk of poor coordination between the United States and Japan and with others in this area. If one country tries to undermine Chinese technological advancement too aggressively, creating collateral damage for others, or possible resentment if one country cuts off, but other countries keep selling and keep investing. The US and Huawei battle is a good example of this area so far. Now, the ASO-Pence dialogue that took place earlier, I think, was an opportunity for the United States and Japan to coordinate on these issues in real time at a very high level, political level. But it went in a different direction, focused on US-Japan trade talks. Now, I would note that the Japan's NSC, and we'll talk about this today, has created an economic security division that is looking to launch a economic security dialogue with the United States. And I think that has great promise. We're not quite yet sure who the counterpart is on the US side, and that's another issue that I want to talk about a little bit. So finally, I'm going to get to my recommendations here. In the paper, just pulling a few out. First, I think we should update the 1988 bilateral science and technology agreement. It has done a lot of good work for our relationship, but we need to focus on two areas of existing imbalance. The first is insufficient coordination between the public and private sectors for R&D investments, and the second is inadequate flexibility on dual-use technologies. And I want to share very briefly a graphic that is in the paper that shows a recommendation that we put forward for the JapanUS Strategic Science, Technology, and Innovation Council. This would be a private sector, national lab, scientific organizations drawing from those groups to create an advisory council to both national security councils and the joint high-level committee, or the JHLC process that takes place as well, that is led in part by state and foreign ministry, and also OSTP and SISTI in the cabinet office. So the purpose of this JUSTIC council is to tighten the loop between the policymaker, the appropriators, and the scientists, the technology specialists, so that that kind of decision-making, overlapping priorities can be identified, and then investments in an infrastructure, collaboration infrastructure between the United States and Japan, I think can more efficiently be carried out. So these areas of AI, quantum computing, space technology in particular, are areas that we focus on in the paper. I think it's also important to deepen research and development funding pools. Now, clearly this is difficult in the COVID era when we're all running massive budget deficits, but I could argue that this actually creates more imperative for collaboration among countries to coordinate and make more efficient use of the investments that they're making in research and development, especially in the infrastructure for R&D, whether it's test beds and other things. Now, the other recommendation is to invest in standard setting, multilateral forums, and this means some flexibility is important because we have to accommodate different countries' perspectives, including the European Union and wherever possible, China, getting them on board in some of these areas. This would also include information sharing among ourselves about supply chains and potential adjustments. Finally, improving coordination on export controls and investment screening. With this new economic security dialogue, I think that could be important, especially it would be nice to reestablish that vice presidential, vice prime minister connection if possible, and strengthening the fundamentals of information and technology security. So I've taken a couple extra minutes than I should have in my wrap up here, but now I want to jump to the panel so everybody can take themselves off mute. And I'm going to start with Terazawa-san. You're in a unique position to comment on these issues from the perspective from Tokyo. And I know you can't necessarily speak on behalf of the government, but how do you personally view this techno-nationalist shift I just talked about? Where do you think our views between the US and Japan are similar in the alliance? Where might they be different, either in substance or priority? And do you see particular risks or opportunities for Japan in this current situation?
Well, thank you, Jim, for your excellent presentation. The simple answer to your question, how important this issue is, this is extremely significant. Let me give you some historical background to provide some answer. After the World War II, Japan has been enjoying peace and prosperity under the dominance of the USA, the Pax Americana. But the rise of China could possibly challenge the basis of our peace and prosperity. Their rise in its economy, technology, military strength, diplomacy could possibly challenge the basis. And that is the reason why in Tokyo, you'll be hearing more discussions about the techno-nationalistic policy. But the same is true for the US. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the US has been the only superpower in the world. But with the rise of China, the US is facing its first serious challenger in 30 years. So how the US and Japan deal with the rise of China is indeed the agenda or the challenge of our generation. As Japan and China, the US, would need to respond to the rise of China, there are so many similarities in our interests and concerns. But at the same time, there are differences. To be frank, Japan, with its limited domestic market, Japan can only prosper in the global world. In particular, China is our largest market. Frankly, we cannot live without China. And since we live nearby China, we don't want to turn East Asia into a region of hostility. So that would lead Japan to prefer a much more multilateral approach in dealing with China, whereas US does not necessarily have to hesitate to use unilateral measures. And I think that's the biggest difference between the US and Japan. While we share many similarities in our goals, interests, and so on, our approach may be different, reflecting the differences in our geographical location and also in the relative position of our economy. There are so many risks surrounding us, as I have touched upon. One of the biggest challenges for us, as I said, is while we should be concerned about the rise of China, the possibility that it can erode our peace and prosperity, but at the same time, they are our biggest market. We need to strike a balance between those two concerns. And at the same time, our approach in dealing with China cannot damage our economic strength. So that's another balance that we need to strike. So those are the risks. But at the same time, there are many, many opportunities, especially since the challenges we're facing has much more economic and technology elements to the challenges. Compared with the years of the Cold War, Japan can potentially play a greater role in partnership with the US because there is much more economic and technological elements in dealing with this challenge. So I can go on to the specifics later on, but I see a great room for opportunities for cooperation between the US and Japan. I should end my initial comment.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's an interesting point, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not throw weights of atomic weapons that we have to, calculate in the balance of power. It's other things that Japan brings to the table. And we'll get back to those specifics in a second. Amy, I want to bring you in. You've seen this transition kind of evolve over time, and from your time in government and now working with private sector clients. Are there aspects that I haven't mentioned that you think deserve more attention, or from your perspective? And what else can you tell us about the challenges of coordinating this kind of a strategy internally from your time in government among all the different agencies and different stakeholders to find that right balance?
Well, thanks, Jim, and thanks to Carnegie for inviting me to join. This paper is just so incredibly timely, not just in talking about US-Japan cooperation, but dealing with what I'm working with my clients with every day, and that is the consequences of a more assertive China on the global stage. And as you said, Jim, yes, China is not necessarily embracing the existing global order. In fact, that is our core challenge. When I was in the US government in the Clinton and Bush administrations, working in China at our embassies and consulates, as well as in Washington, we were in the stage of China joining the World Trade Organization and us making sure China was living up to its commitments of accession to the WTO. And industry played a very important role in working with the US government to highlight issues where China was trying to introduce mandatory encryption standards. We all remember the WAPI debate, or Green Dam, software being put on personal computers. Industry and the US government together pushed back with China. And instead of China unilaterally implementing policies that would have restricted Japanese and American investments in China, the Chinese response was, we'll go back to the global standard setting agencies and reworked and indefinitely postponed these new initiatives. And that was very positive. But I have to say that the fundamental challenge that we've continued to face, the US government, in working with China, particularly over the last 7 years, is a more assertive stance of techno-nationalism and self-reliance that is putting at risk Japanese, American, European, all foreign investment in the market, as China not only in the domestic market is trying to shut out competition, but then, of course, unfairly compete on the global stage. And so, as Terazawa-san said, dealing with this is the most important thing for the Japanese economy that relies on globalization, and of course, the US economy and our companies who, as you cited in the report, Jim, are worried that US defensive actions to counteract Chinese activities are actually going to impede our competitiveness. In the short term, that might benefit Japanese companies operating in the China market. But I think Japan and the United States absolutely together are worried about China trying to undermine the global system that we all have benefited from so much. And as a result, as you put it in the paper, the United States overreacting on defensive measures that could impact our competitiveness, including Japan's phenomenal tradition of investment in the United States. If Japanese companies are forced to choose between continuing to operate in China or siding with the United States, that is a choice they don't want to make. And just very specifically on export controls, if there is a de minimis amount of American technology in Japanese products, then maybe they're going to say, either we give up the China market, which, as Terazawa-san just said, is not good for Japan, or we move our investment, our R&D, out of the United States so we don't have to comply with US export control rules. That's bad for the US economy, that's bad for US-Japan relations, and it's good for China. And so the recommendations that you've made, I think, unfortunately, we just haven't had a robust set of offensive initiatives to focus, as you rightly direct us to, more recently in the US government. And so from my perspective, working with American and non-American companies, it has been more challenging going to the US government and talking about the costs of some of these defensive measures. And so absolutely trying to encourage the US government to think in concert with others, Japan being a key partner, about offensive measures that will maintain American competitiveness, rather than have us in some ways crippled by US policies that absolutely are focused on competition with China, a key priority for US national security and economic security goals. But the way that we do it, and I think some of the recommendations that you make in this paper are incredibly important, and those voices unfortunately haven't been heard to the fullest measure and responded to in this administration.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I appreciate your views on the paper, and I appreciate that. And you've given us a great segue. This was actually not completely planned, but I previewed the paper recently with a group, and I talked about this concern that my main concern is overreaction, the risk of overreaction. And I got a little pushback from a Japanese executive in particular who said, yes, but we, on the Japan side, his concern is that in Japan in particular, they may be underestimating or underreacting, in particular to the cyber threat in corporate Japan. And so here I want to bring in Osawa-san, because you've worked a lot in the cybersecurity area. Are you concerned that the private sector could underreact to the cybersecurity challenge, and which means if there's more investment in R&D, all the offensive investment, if it's just going to be stolen out the back door, is not necessarily very attractive to companies. So how do you evaluate our two countries, how our two countries are dealing with the cybersecurity aspect of this? And are there things we should be doing going forward to keep ourselves more closely aligned?
Thank you, Jim. First of all, I really appreciate Carnegie endowment for hosting this timely webinar today. And I agree with the notion that the Japanese executive told you. It is true that the Japanese private sector underestimates cyber threat to their companies. 2 years before, I was asked to conduct a cybersecurity research project in the Keidanren Policy Research Center. Our study group mainly focused on Chinese cyber espionage activities against Japanese leading enterprises, and found that the more than 10 Chinese state-sponsored cyber attacking group repeatedly conducting information theft cyber attack, and they have been stepping up their attacks on Japan, particularly since late of 2016. The victims that the Chinese cyber espionage group target are industries and business entities that have the cutting-edge technologies. These kind of technologies appear on the list of Chinese recent manufacturing strategy made in China 2025. So my colleague and I would like to warn about the danger of Chinese cyber attack against Japanese enterprises. They intend to hold a symposium on the topic of Chinese cyber espionage in the late of 2018. However, one of business executive drew a negative conclusion. The symposium was unfulfilled because of the symposium would irritate Chinese government's nerves. So the problem is not their business executives pro-Chinese attitude, but the lack of the situation awareness of how serious cyber danger they really face it. So anyway, these Chinese cyber espionage are linked to the Chinese long-term strategy for seeking technologies and economical supremacy. it left untreated, we are going to lose our economic and technological competitive advantage. Thus, as you see, subdomain becomes a real battleground of geoeconomics between China and Western allies, including US and Japan. So and up to now, the national response to cyber attacks has focused on the passive cyber defense, such as securing the IT system and the protection of the critical infrastructures. These measures of passive defense are now insufficient for the Western allies. In order to stop the potential state adversaries conducting cyber espionage on our leading technology, Western allies, US and Japan especially, have to employ new strategy that is based on comprehensive cyber deterrence, especially enhancing cyber deterrence by punishment, using a variety of policy tools, including the cyber counterattack. So a more proactive cyber defense by such means as a continuous monitoring of attacking groups and responses to attack using big data analysis now required. To do that, joint cyber situation awareness, I call it CSA, are needed. Monitoring activities of cyber adversaries and accumulating a vast amount of electronic information from the internet, and conducting post-event analysis and following up using the big data analysis. And doing to keep ourselves more closely aligned, I think the US and Japan need cyber version of the alliance coordination mechanism or the bilateral cooperation mechanism and for the joint cyber situation awareness. So I know the two countries hold a cyber dialogue several times a year between intelligence to intelligence and policy to policy, but it is not enough. The cyber situation moves on the minutes by minutes, seconds by seconds. We need real-time joint cyber situation awareness center like the U.S. National Cybersecurity Communication Integration Center in the DHS. So that's my comment for your question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And you've prompted me now to do something completely silly because I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to share on the screen and hopefully you can see it. Oh, wait a minute. You're not going to see it yet because I have to actually share it. Let me see here. But I wanted to show, because you mentioned the ACM, and these are some of the graphics from the working paper. But right, just so the audience can see, the alliance coordination mechanism is that ACM little box there and kind of in the middle on the right. And it was primarily designed to deal with military threats or real kind of traditional security challenges. And it can be scaled up based on when there's a crisis, but usually it functions in that kind of sweet spot between the 2+2 process and the joint staff mill-to-mill area. But it's over on the left that I wanted to draw attention, because this is where the science and technology collaboration has traditionally been positioned within the alliance, and all these different ministry to department relationships. Some are 40, 50, 60, 50 years old. There's a great tradition of cooperation in these areas, but it's not necessarily tied to the strategic imperatives and the challenges that we face today. So it's interesting, Osawa-san, you're kind of talking in a way about, it's almost like our Justic proposal, but something a little bit more track one, kind of coordination oriented for dealing with threats that might sit somewhere, I don't know, up at the top, toward the top there between everything. But anyway, I just thought I'd share that. But Terazawa-san, let me come back to you on this question then of how we should deal with this within the alliance. And I want to ask you a little bit about this economic security branch of the NSC, the NSS in Japan, and how do you see it? What are your hopes or expectations for how that branch will function, and what it will contribute to Japan's strategy, and then how it might fit in an alliance context?
Okay, well, thank you very much. For those who do not know about the establishment of the economic team at the NSS, which is the National Security Secretariat in the Japanese government, this new economic team was established formally in April, but actually started back in November last year. And the objective was to deal with the economic security issues, to serve as the headquarters to deal with economic security issues within the Japanese government. Prior to the establishment of this new office, the specific elements of economic security issues had been handled by each respective ministry, depending upon its jurisdiction. But this old structure had a very serious weakness in its structure, since many economic security issues cut across various ministries. The lack of coordination within the Japanese government led to delay in decision-making, or in many cases, the absence of inputs from economic security issues in the decision-making by each respective ministry. And so with that recognition, Prime Minister Abe gave a direction to set up this new team under the NSS. And with this new team under the NSS, which would oversee all the aspects of the government activities related to national economic security issues, I would have high hopes that we will have a very coordinated approach to deal with economic security issues. But this is a newly formed organization, so there are a number of challenges we're facing. One is that before this establishment, there was no coordination function within the Japanese government for economic security issues. Now with the establishment of this new organization, there's a tendency to put every issues related to economic security issues to this team. Naturally, we don't have unlimited number of staff working for this team. So this team would have to be selective in the issues they decide to focus on themselves, and decide on issues that they would let other ministries handle. So that's, we are still in this process to make that distinction between the issues that will be dealt directly by this team and the other issues left for other ministries with some coordination by this new economic team at the NSS. Another challenge is, frankly, to find the right counterparts in the US and EU. In the US, it would naturally be NSC, the counterpart. But the recent change in the White House would probably make it more difficult for having cooperation. If we are not mistaken, until very recently, NSC and NEC under the White House had a coordination or integrated. Some people had dual responsibility working for NSC or NEC, but we understand these two organizations are now being more separated. So national security issues and economic policy are handled by two different teams. So when we talk about economic security issues, it would have both the components of national strategy security as well as economic security. But if you have separation of organizations, it will be more difficult to speak and have a consultation with White House. Furthermore, I do have so much sympathy for my friends working in the White House. They are frankly simply overloaded with too many issues with a very limited number of staff. And so one of the challenges for us is that occasionally we may have a good discussion with our counterparts within the White House, but to make anything into reality, we need to engage in continuous discussion to realize those agenda. But if we can only meet them once in several months, good discussion and nothing happening, and another good discussion and nothing happening. So I think we hope the manpower or the organization within the White House to deal with these economic security issues will be strengthened by having two perspectives, both national security as well as the economic policy, and have more people working for this purpose. Just for your reference, our team at the economic team at the NSS, we are aiming to establish a team of 20 people to handle the various coordinating activities within the Japanese government. And I think my friends within the White House will be envious of us of having that kind of a large size of people. But even in Japan, still with that size of people, there are too many issues that have economic security issues elements to them. And so while we are struggling with that nearly 20 people team, our counterpart in the US will probably have a much smaller team with many more countries that you will have to look after. So it's more challenging within the White House. So certainly with the importance of economic security issues, I would hope that it will be strengthened in the United States. The situation could be even worse in EU. The national security issues are basically under the jurisdiction of each member state. So since the EU is not national, so it's wrong to use national security, but the security aspect of the EU is relatively weak. And so if I were to find anyone within EU dealing dedicated to economic security issues, I would have a difficulty finding any counterparts within the EU. So with the growing importance of economic security issues, even in Europe, I would hope that a similar counterpart will be developed in EU as well. So these are the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving us that perspective. And maybe if we can develop secure communications in this kind of format, where you don't have to fly back and forth and meet people, that actually might be a good development there. We're already moving forward on time, and I want to get to people's questions. So if you do have a question, type it into the YouTube chat and they'll send it to me here. But there's one key question I want to get to here with Amy before we turn to that. How about the China aspect in all of this? I mean, China gets a say in how all this develops. And if I'm sitting in Beijing, there certainly are elements of certainly what the United States is doing. And if all the countries truly effectively collaborate and coordinate on kind of techno-nationalist policies, it would be easy to see that as a direct threat or challenge to China. Are there ways we can engage with China to kind of temper some of this elements of competition? I mean, that will save us resources and pain in the future as well. So we have an incentive, but based on your interaction with China, what's your view about how China sees all this and what our options are to engage with China on this front?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in many ways, outside of China, the view is that, a more assertive China on the global stage, and particularly with techno-nationalism and many of the policies it's pursuing, is creating a reaction from others. And the reaction is, how do we better compete? I mean, again, as Terazawa-san said, Japan cannot live without China. I would add US industry doesn't want to live without China either. But, decoupling is becoming policy in the United States because it's becoming policy in Beijing. And so I fully agree that we have to find ways to work with China on many of these issues. But I think the vulnerability, frankly speaking, of the policies that we've been pursuing, trying to deal with a more competitive China over the past 2 years, is we haven't been working concert with our allies enough to build up the leverage to hopefully temper some of these Chinese practices that deviate from the international system. And so we are leaving Japan and the EU and other major allies of ours to have to unilaterally deal with a more assertive China as well. And so the US government, of course, has been extremely focused on how to deal with the rise of China and what kind of national security, economic security threat that brings. We'll get into the impact of COVID, I'm sure, on all of this in Q&A. But I guess my fundamental point, Jim, is yes, the Chinese government is watching very closely to see whether and how the United States is going to be able to build a coalition to deal with many of these issues that we individually as countries have been facing. And frankly speaking, I think it's been to Beijing's advantage that this administration, while very focused on China, very tough with China, hasn't been able to get that leverage that I think we more effectively could gain from working with others. And so Beijing is looking at the November election, what a second term Trump administration or a first term Biden administration will do differently to more effectively push back on some of China's assertive behavior. But I will say, I'm not as worried about us being able to work constructively with China in areas where we do have common interests. I'm more worried about the fact that we have more and more diverging interests that we can't effectively deal with Beijing by ourselves.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in. And Terazawa-san mentioned, this scope and scale of the challenge of dealing with all these different issues and the challenges of managing that just in a government-to-government framework. I think in many ways that highlights the value and the need to really have robust private sector engagement on these issues, and anything we can do to kind of sync that up and create that synergy will really help. And there was a question in here that came in about what about the strategic retreat of the United States, which is giving space for China to move more freely. And this would maybe apply to some of the standards areas. I mean, it was interesting, Amy, you brought in that context before of a default back to the international standard, but increasingly China's been much more aggressive, kind of investing in those multilateral forums. So Osawa-san, I didn't get to my last question for you. So let me give you a chance to kind of be the first one to take a crack at this question. What are the perceptions kind of from your personal perceptions or in Tokyo about this idea of kind of US strategic retreat and kind of international engagement or multilateral forum engagement? Is that a big concern? Is that an area that needs to be addressed in your mind?
Well, this technology competition between China and the US is now in popular discussion theme in academic debate in Tokyo. But as Amy-san mentioned, it is difficult for the Japanese company to select the US or US alliance or Chinese market. It is quite difficult question for the Japanese economic executives. Also, it is difficult question for the Japanese Prime Minister and ministry and bureaucrats in Tokyo. So, but there is a growing recognition that the contest for supremacy between US and China will be unavoidable, especially in digital arena. So some of Japanese scholars and policy experts in think tank regarded this as an aspect of new Cold War between the two big countries. So, and even Tokyo isn't on board for the tariff war that Trump administration started with China, but already start to take selectively applied economic security policy and expand cooperation with the US. For example, it is reported that both governments coordinated their policy on the issue of avoidance of supply chain risk in 5th generation telecommunication infrastructure building. So now I'd like to say that Japan has to align our economic security policy against China in careful way based on our allies with the US and European country. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, thanks. And if anybody else wants to jump in on that, please feel free. Please.
If I could respond to Jim's question about the strategic retreat of the U.S. from international organizations, I think we are seeing if we ignore international organizations, what would happen in the case of WHO? Just because we have been ignoring, so to speak, WHO, and now WHO is probably not the most unbiased organization in the world, but it does matter in this pandemic, fight against a pandemic, to have an effective and unbiased organization. So rather than ignoring those international organizations, we, Japan and the US, will need to work together to participate and improve those institutions. It is unfortunate that the US response appears to be leaving those international organizations like WHO or leaving the dispute resolution system of WTO. So my strong wish is, rather than retreating from international organization, get back to international organization, work with allies and friends to transform those international organizations, because they are important for health area or trade area or whatever area. We have to be more focused on rebuilding those international organizations.
Yeah, and increasingly it's a challenge in the technology side of things, because it's not easy to master some of these technology issues, and the emerging questions about standards or values or rules about how things are going to be developed is not easy for traditional diplomats or other people to absorb. I wonder if there's also a need to have more cross-fertilization between whether it's industry and government to pull that expertise together. That gets to one other question, and this may be the last one because we have a hard stop today because there's another Carnegie event starting using our pipeline immediately right after this one. That was asking about kind of given U.S. broad interest in the region, sometimes with cross-cutting goals across countries, how can the U.S. be a trustworthy ally to all parties in a sense? So I guess the question is kind of getting at that issue of multiple stakeholders and multiple interests across kind of this coalition building challenge of sorts, actually getting beyond talk and having sufficiently concrete enough priorities and an ability to act on that. It's kind of a general question, but maybe we can wrap up with people can offer kind of final comments before we wrap up with that in mind about next steps for the alliance in this broad challenge. Amy, why don't I start with you?
Sure, I will bring COVID into this because I think we're in a moment in time where China's global reputation is being impacted by its global response to COVID. I don't think it's about China's domestic response, which has been, I think, very effective. But I do think it is calling into question for many countries, how much is China trying to prop up and support the global system, and how much is China self-interestedly just pursuing its own agenda? And I think the challenge for leaders in Beijing is that they do have to appeal to other countries in a sense and say, we, China's involvement on the global stage, our leadership on technology issues is good for the world. And again, unfortunately, I think COVID hasn't helped China make that argument. And so the question is this a moment for the United States to recover from some, frankly, missteps and work together with other partners to reassert itself as a defender of the rules-based system? I think it's very challenging, as Terazawa-san said, when the United States is not supporting the WTO and pulling out of the WHO. But again, our elections in November are quite consequential on this issue. And like I said, it's not about who wins. It's about how the winner will behave in 2021 differently in order to regain for the United States its role in promoting techno-nationalism, because we're responding to China and an increasingly assertive China, but in a way that appeals to other players, so that we're working together to meet this threat and not just unilaterally.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, we're going to have to get beyond China as a campaign talking point to attract votes and really get into the details of this. So final comments. We have just a few minutes left, but Osawa-san, and then I'll give Terazawa-san the final section.
Jim, and a quick short comment about the we have to share the threat awareness in not only cyber domain but also the investment area, or foreign workers or students from China, because of the China has a long-term tech acquisition strategy. China effort to get the cutting-edge technology by means of not only cyber espionage but also the physical side, such as the investment, joint business, or guest workers or foreign students. So we have to share the risk and threat not only between the US and Japan, and also the European countries and ASEAN, India, or Australia, New Zealand, whatever. But we have to share the what kind of case we are facing now about China. So then these kind of shared awareness will lead some kind of coalition against China to protect our cutting-edge technology. Thank you very much.
Great. No, thank you. Terazawa-san, final thoughts? I know we had to cram everything into a short hour here, but
as Amy said, this COVID-19 situation will provide an excellent opportunity for US and Japan to show leadership, and an excellent opportunity for us to work together. One thing is that many people in the world are angry about the lack of transparency in how China has been handling this COVID-19. This is an excellent issue of value, which we respect, which the US and Japan and other countries can ensure that transparency can be respected. This is one issue we can work together. The other is privacy. We don't want to sacrifice privacy for the sake of public health. China is promoting that their system of surveillance is superior in this regard. But we have to demonstrate together that without intensive government surveillance, we can win the battle against COVID-19. This is something that we need to work together to prove. Otherwise, the totalitarian or authoritarian style may make the propaganda that their system is better. Finally, the cooperation between the US and Japan has been strong on the defensive side, but not on the offensive side, or cooperation in S&T. But in the fight against COVID-19, it will provide an excellent opportunity that we can work together, not just talks, but work together to develop vaccines, drugs to deal with COVID-19. Yeah. So with this step, I think our cooperation partnership can be elevated to a different level. So let's use this opportunity of COVID-19 for a better future.
That's a great point. It's a concrete thing to work on now, and it's not just process. It's for all of our benefit. So I'm sorry to all those who asked questions. We didn't get to those, but we'll try to get to them another time. And the working paper is out, so you can see it on the website. My thanks to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed working with you, and thanks to all who joined us for this event. And with that, I'll say good night or good day.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.